Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. I am, of course, your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. There's nothing special about this podcast, audio-wise. I'm not running it through a tape machine or anything like that. I hope you've all had a great weekend. Hope you had a great Valentine's Day, if that's a thing where you live. That's an interesting question. There's lots of holidays that we celebrate in the United States that obviously aren't holidays in other countries. For instance, Thanksgiving isn't something that people don't celebrate Thanksgiving on the last Thursday or whatever of every November the way Americans do. Now, other countries do have their versions of Thanksgiving, but it's not American Thanksgiving. Another big holiday that a lot of countries don't celebrate is Halloween. Halloween is a very American holiday. So that's just got me thinking on this little first rabbit trail here of the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. Is Valentine's Day a thing where you live? I know I have a lot of listeners around the world, South America, Middle East, Ireland, across Europe, the UK. Is Valentine's a thing where you live in your little corner of the world? I don't mean little like physically little, but you know what I'm saying. We're cozy where we live. It's what we know. My little corner of the world is this little slice of Texas called Houston, and that's my little corner of the world, and we definitely celebrate Valentine's Day. So if you do celebrate Valentine's Day, hope you had a good Valentine's Day. I hope you treated yourself as a Valentine. What did I see somewhere? Treat yourself like the person you love or something like that? I don't know. It's kind of sappy, but we can get sappy here in Geek Therapy Radio. What I wanted to immediately talk about was something that I mentioned in the last podcast, not the broadcast, but the podcast, where I went over some of the tabs I had open on my Chrome browser. I briefly mentioned at the end of that episode that Sony says it's not going to be able to sell the PlayStation for below $450. While that statement is true, or is likely to be true, I need to clarify that a little bit. What Sony actually says is that it cannot get the manufacturing cost below $450 per unit. So Sony cannot make each PlayStation for less than $450 out of their own pocket. This is interesting. It's kind of one of the same about what I've been talking about. You can manufacture a video games console, and it costs, let's say it costs Sony $450 out of their pocket to produce each one. Sony can technically release the PlayStation. If it costs them $450, they can release the PlayStation 5 for $400 and take a $50 loss on each PlayStation 5 they sell, and make up the money elsewhere. They can charge $1 more per game, dollar more per game. They can charge developers a little bit more for the license to make games on the PlayStation 5. They can pass the buck literally down to the consumer. They can make, any subscription service a little bit more per month. They can make, like I said, games cost a little bit more. They can squeeze the balloon on one end to make up for selling each PlayStation 5 at a loss. I don't think they're going to do that. Manufacturers typically don't do that. When Sony, I believe it was the, what does it say? I think it's the PlayStation 3. No. It was the, PlayStation 4 cost about $380 to manufacture. It cost $380 out of Sony's pocket to build each machine. And when they launched the PS4 in 2013, they sold the PS4 for $400. That's about $20 more than their manufacturing cost. That's not a huge profit margin, but it was a tactic that worked out. And if they followed that same tactic, then the PlayStation 5 would be around $470 if they went on that arbitrary $20 profit margin for the actual console itself. If they manufacture the PS5 for $450 out of their own pocket and then turn around and sell it to us for a weird sum of $470, that's $20 of profit per system. But here's the thing. Just like the PS4, Sony is waiting for Microsoft to announce the price of the Xbox Series X. It's kind of a Mexican standoff right now. They're waiting for each other to be the first one to pull the trigger so that they can see where the shot goes and then have better aim on their part for their second shot. They can make it count better. That's not exactly what a Mexican standoff is, but you get what I'm saying here. They're waiting for the other guy to pull the trigger first before they make their move. So what we know right now is Sony is saying $450 per PlayStation 5, and that boils down to basically costs for different components. For instance, flash memory, NAND flash memory, for instance, and DRAM, is the prices in that market are going up as far as the wholesalers and manufacturers are concerned, because smartphones, you got Samsung and Apple, the two biggest ones, Huawei, all of them coming out with new smartphones, and they all need access to DRAM and flash memory. So the price of memory for manufacturers is at a premium right now because everybody wants it. It's just supply and demand. That said, Microsoft could say that they're going to release the Series X for, let's say, $500. Let's say Microsoft comes out the gate, $499 for the Microsoft Series X. That means Sony immediately after would say, okay, we're at $480 or $470 or at cost $450 or below cost $399. Either way, they're going to wait for Sony or for Microsoft. If Microsoft comes out of the gate and says we're selling the Microsoft's Xbox Series X, I still hate that name. We're selling the Series X for $600. Sony can wipe their brow. Okay, we're going to do $500. So we still have a $50 profit margin on each console. Either way, Sony is waiting for Microsoft to drop the ball first, to take the first shot. And this is something Sony has done before. In 2013 at E3, that's when Microsoft announced that they were going to sell the Xbox One for $499. Sony immediately came back and said, okay, we're selling the PlayStation 4 for $399, $100 cheaper. They waited and waited and waited and Microsoft said, man, E3's coming. We have to do something. We have to do something. So that same thing is going to occur this year. There's going to be a major kind of press conference. There's going to be a major media event to detail release and detail things like that. And Microsoft or Sony is going to say, one of us has to do it. And they're going to wait to see who does it first. And with the last console generation between the Xbox One and the PS4, Microsoft pulled the trigger first, $499 for the Xbox One. Sony immediately said, okay, we're at $100 less, $399. And it worked well in Sony's case. So what do you think about that? I read a comment somewhere, and of course there's probably an Ars Technica. That's a big website that I use. Like I said, I also use New Atlas and Popular Mechanics and all sorts of stuff. But when it comes to gaming news, right now, Ars Technica is usually what catches my eye the most. So it was a comment down there, had to be. It was basically, and this is so interesting because this is a thought I had just the other day, and I'll set it up with this. We're talking about the next generation of consoles, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X. The other day, I looked in the mirror, and I remembered this memory that I had when I was maybe, I don't know, 11 or 12 years old, looking in the mirror at myself. I wondered when I was 11, 12 years old, looking in the mirror at myself, what I would look like when I was 25 years old. I'm 36 years old now. But when I was 11 or 12, I wondered, what am I going to look like when I'm an adult? And I just kind of sat there and looked at my face and like kind of imagined like wrinkles or crow's feet or blotchy skin or whatever to make myself look older, gray hairs. I wasn't anticipating balding, but those are the cards I was dealt. And the second thought, the more poignant thought, other than what am I going to look like when I'm older in 10 or 15 years, 20 years? The vivid thought I had when I was 11 or 12 was, will I still be playing video games when I'm 25 years old or when I'm an adult? Are video games going to be a fad that you just kind of grow out of? And at the time I thought, yeah, there's no way I can be an adult, 25, 35 years old, and video games still be a part of where I spend money, a part of where kids spend money on video games. I couldn't imagine an adult spending money on video games. And here's where the comment comes in, that comment I was mentioning. He brought up a very good point in that, yes, absolutely, gaming and video games have followed us 80s babies and 90s babies through to adulthood. That video game systems now aren't aimed necessarily directly at kids, whereas Nintendos were aimed at kids, Super Nintendos were aimed at kids. Now, those manufacturers know that we have grown up with them. So now they're manufacturing and they're advertising and they're making game systems that are kind of, the demographic they're aiming for is no longer the 12-year-old kid wanting to play Mario on a Nintendo. Now it's an adult, 25, 35, it's a millennial, whatever, who has a job, is working, is relatively financially stable, I just mean more financially stable than when you were 12 years old, who has some sort of expendable income and who is willing to spend the money on each console generation, which typically now is 5 to 7 years ish, roughly. So that's the thing. It doesn't, the pricing of the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X isn't as critical as it was when, for the first few generations of consoles, where we had to ask our parents, we had to convince our parents, who had nothing to do with video games, didn't hardly understand the concept of video games, constantly complained about video games making kids violent or vapid or void or drones or whatever. They didn't understand video games. Everything was a Nintendo. If you had a PlayStation 2, your mom would tell you to turn off the Nintendo. That's not the case now. We are the parents now. The manufacturers and developers just have to convince us adults to buy the system. So it's no longer us. When a PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X comes out, it's not a 12-year-old kid so much anymore. I mean, it is and it isn't. But not so much anymore is it the kid trying to convince the parents to buy them something that they have really no clue about. We're the parents now of those 12-year-old kids. We know exactly what the video game system is. We don't need to be swayed about it. What it boils down to is what is technically cheaper than the other or not. A lot of people just buy every system. A lot of adults, a lot of gamers just buy every system. I don't mean every single person. There's no way in heck that I would drop $1,000, every 5 years or whatever to get a PlayStation 5 and an Xbox Series X. The most recent PlayStation I have is the PlayStation 3. I've never felt the need or the desire to go PS4 or Xbox One. All my friends have it. Adult friends have it. I play it plenty. I just never had the desire to do it myself. But had I been so inclined, yeah, on the grand scheme of things, $300 or $400, it is a lot of money. I mean, it is a lot of money and it isn't. Like I spend more. What did I do last year at the dentist? I got a crown put on. There's adult expenses that make a $400 or $500 PlayStation seem inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. Now, I'm not suggesting you spend your money willy-nilly or you spend your money on a video game system rather than a big chunk of your mortgage. But the manufacturers, Sony and Microsoft, are no longer trying to convince the kids. They're trying to convince the parents. because we grew up with them. We grew up on video games. That being said, adults are more likely to buy it. Adults are more likely to buy the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. That's a huge segment of the market. Kind of understand what I'm saying here? So the price isn't that who has to come out for $200, because a 12-year-old kid has to convince their parents to spend $500. It's a lot easier to convince the parents to spend $200. That's not the case anymore. We are the parents. When I was 11 or 12 years old, looking in that mirror, wondering what I would look like when I was 25, and if video games would still be a big part of our life as adults, the answer was a resounding yes, is a resounding yes. So it's no longer convincing the 12-year-old kid in the mirror, it's convincing a 36-year-old adult with bills. I just think it's funny the way history has worked out in terms of video games. But as I'm thinking back on it, my dad has always played video games to one degree or another. This is something else I thought about the other day. My dad, I was thinking, like, what kind of gamer was he? Is he a console gamer, PC? He was a PC gamer. Yes, he played consoles. One of the rules growing up when a new, Nintendo came out, Nintendo 64, Super Nintendo, GameCube, whatever, and we wanted by the time GameCube came out, I could do that myself, but those early 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit generation consoles, 64-bit generation consoles, I did have to try to convince my parents to help buy a video game system. And the rule with my dad was always, we have to earn at least half of the cost ourselves. We have to mow lawns, do whatever, do chores, extra chores, and come up with half the cost ourselves. And there has to be a hockey game available on the system. So there was ice hockey on the NES. There was Wayne Gretzky's hockey on the Super Nintendo. Was it Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey on the Nintendo 64? So the hockey game thing was fairly easy. The harder part was coming up with half the cost ourselves, but we were able to do it. But my dad, the reason why he asked for hockey games is because he loved playing hockey games on Nintendo, on Super Nintendo, on the Nintendo 64, on the PlayStation 2, but he was mostly a PC gamer. He would play a game called Nom. Those of you who remember that game, was the people who made Doom. ID Software made Nom. It was basically Doom, but set in Vietnam. My dad was a Vietnam veteran. I've gone into that before, which I never understood why he'd want to play a violent war video game, having PTSD from that exact war. I didn't question it. The point is, he liked to play, what was it, Comanche Attack Helicopter, something like that. He played computer games, PC games, more often than not. He was a PC gamer mostly, but also a console gamer. The whole commentary of PC versus console gaming is kind of silly. There's not many adults who get into arguments over the superiority of consoles over PC or PC over consoles, because the majority of adults just have both. Maybe I shouldn't say majority, but a lot do. And at the very least, it's all video games. However you want to play video game is completely up to you. The benefit of console is that you just sit down, kick back, put your feet up, grab the controller, and start playing a game. Graphics and frame rates aren't the most important thing to you. Good games are the most important thing to you. With PC, it's way more tweakable. It's way more about getting the most frames per second possible, overclocking, dialing up the settings to the maximum visual prettiness. It's way more of a tinkerer's game system, a PC is. But they both have their pros and cons. They both have their pros. That's a better way to put it. They both have their pros. I got my PlayStation 2 hooked up to the TV again, and I have my little. It's not little. It's a kind of a big game folder of all my CDs and DVDs of PlayStation 2 games, and there are some great games for the PlayStation 2 that hold up great even today. Do any of you remember, or have any of you ever played a Capcom game? Capcom made so many good games, but it's kind of more obscure for the PS2. It's called God Hand. It's a brawler. It's a beat 'em up. It's kind of like it's a Western, a very goofy spaghetti Western, kind of like Final Fight. Capcom made Final Fight, where basically it's Street Fighter sprites, effectively Guy and what's the other one's name? But it's a side-scroller, X-Men arcade game, side-scroller beat 'em up. God Hand is a 3D first-person view or third-person view brawler, just to beat 'em up. You go through each stage, beat up all the enemies, clear the area, get to the goal. It's that kind of game, but it's so goofy. It's so goofy and fun. PlayStation 2, God Hand, amazing. That's not to forget about things like Shadow of the Colossus and God of War and so many fighting games, so many great fighting games on the PlayStation 2. So many great hockey games on the PlayStation 2. Baseball games, sports games in general on the PlayStation 2. The graphics are dated, but the gameplay and the games themselves still hold up. And now, I think more than ever, and I'll start wrapping up the podcast with this thought. Those of us who've grown up with great video games and have a very nostalgic soft spot for NES games, 8-bit games, and 16-bit games, there's kind of this awakening that's been happening over the past several years, past decade or so, when manufacturers and console manufacturers and game designers keep pushing how beautiful the game looks, how graphically intensive, and it pushes the envelopes of technology. A lot of those games sucked. They just weren't good. And we realized that graphics didn't make a game. Good graphics didn't make a game nice to play. It was wonderful when you had great graphics come together with a great game. Shadow of the Colossus pushed the PlayStation 2 to its absolute limits. Gran Turismo 4 pushed the PlayStation 2 to the absolute limits, and it's a gorgeous game. They were both absolutely stunning games for their era. Those are two examples of games that came together with graphically beautiful technology along with great gameplay. But now more than ever, we've woken up to realize it's about gameplay. We would like a great game first. So you have games like Stardew Valley. You have all these pixel games coming out, these side scrollers and remakes of, obviously kind of in the vein of Mega Man and stuff like that, 8-bit and 16-bit side scrollers with a few extra visual effects like ocular occlusion, what am I thinking of? I'm blanking out. I do that from time to time when I'm in the middle of a podcast. But you have these retro-looking games coming out that are great to play. Meat Boy, Cuphead. It's not a pixel game. It's kind of an old style, 1930s, 40s, 50s Disney kind of style, art style. But you get what I'm saying. There's been this resurgence on games that don't push the envelopes of your system, but have focused on making the games great to play, the gameplay great, the story great, and then the graphics kind of come second. The graphics are only as good as they need to be to serve the story or to serve the gameplay. I guess that's all I have for this podcast this morning. I am recording it in the morning. It's always interesting to hear how my voice sounds in the morning compared to when I record podcasts in the afternoon. But I'm really enjoying this new schedule of podcast release, and I thank you again from the bottom of my heart for understanding letting me do this. I worked on a lot of music last night. I've been able to tinker with a lot of stuff. Just feels good to have the freedom to do what I want at least a few days out of the week, and I very much appreciate you understanding all of that. Jack is cleaning himself disgustingly next to me, so I think we're going to wrap up the podcast there. Thank you for listening to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. If you like the podcast, I would love it if you would share it with any friends or family that you would think would be interesting. Your local radio station, too. Email your local radio station or call them. Ask to talk to the program director or the email for the program director and tell them that you would like to hear Geek Therapy Radio on your local radio station. That would be really, really cool. Yes, I know podcast is where it's at. Podcast is the future, but I would still love to be syndicated because the radio show is good promotion for the podcast. But most importantly, please understand that you are worthy of love. You are worthy of giving love. You are worthy of receiving love. And you are worthy of your own self respect. So each day, let's try to chip away at that wall between us and our self-doubts and our self-respect. And I think if we do that by leaning into our geek thing, finding out what we're a geek about, learning a new geek thing, getting back into an old geek thing, sharing that geek things with others, as long as it's not self-destructive or destructive to others or at the cost of others, I think that's a good way to kind of boost our self-esteem, and also a way to kind of dig ourselves out of any sort of depressive rut we may be in. Maybe we're just in a rough patch. Maybe we have had clinical depression our whole life. But I think geek therapy is a good way to alleviate that, at least. Just alleviate that feeling of darkness and despair or self-doubt. Lean into your geek thing. Geek therapy is a good thing. So thank you for listening, and I will see you all tomorrow.